I'm Nobody. Who Are You? By Emily Dickinson. Poetry Lesson 1. Our learning targets for today's poetry lesson are: I understand poetry by applying a variety of strategies, and I appreciate poetry by listening to its rhyme, rhythm, and overall sound. In today's lesson, we are going to focus on learning new strategies that will help us appreciate poetry and read poetry more effectively. Now let's talk about the strategies that we are going to be using in today's poetry lesson. There's an attachment in Google Classroom under Poetry Lesson 1 that also has the poetry strategies and a definition for each of the strategies. So the first strategy that we're going to be using today is to preview the poem and read it aloud a few times. So when we read a poem aloud a few times, it's going to help us get an overall feel for the language, rhyme, and rhythm of the poem. The second strategy we are going to be using today is to visualize the images and clarify words and phrases. I want you to think about this. There are pictures in poems and poems in pictures. What do you think that means? When we are visualizing something, we are seeing a picture that the author is painting in our head. And this is the same strategy that we use when we're reading a book. So when you visualize the image, what picture is the author trying to paint in your head? So what are you seeing? And the last strategy we're going to be using today is to evaluate the poem's theme and allow your understanding to grow. When we are evaluating a poem's theme, we are going to be making inferences. And when you make an inference, you are reading between the lines. In order to make an inference, you are going to pay close attention to the details in the poem to make a logical assumption. An inference is a logical judgment based on a writer's words as well as your own knowledge and experience. So while you're trying to make these inferences, I also want you to think about, does this connect to your life? And that's going to make evaluating a poem's theme just a little bit easier. So now that we've talked about the 3 different strategies, let's start with the first one. So we're going to read the poem aloud a few times. I Am Nobody, Who Are You? By Emily Dickinson. I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know, how dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. So when we're reading poetry, we're going to read it through a couple times. So that was our first read. Let's read it a second time. I Am Nobody, Who Are You? By Emily Dickinson. I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know, how dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. And let's read it through one last time. I am nobody. Who are you? By Emily Dickinson. I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know, how dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. So when we're reading a poem and we come across an unfamiliar word, we're going to need to take some time to use our context clues or look it up in a dictionary to understand what the word means. Because if we don't understand the unfamiliar word, then we're not going to understand the poem. And part of analyzing poetry is that we have to understand what the poem is saying. So there are two words in this poem that we just read that I thought that maybe we didn't quite know what they meant. So dreary means dull, bleak, and lifeless, or depressing. And a bog is a wet, muddy ground too soft to support a heavy body. So now that we've gone over those unfamiliar words, I want you to take a second, go back, reread the poem, and then we can move on and we can talk about some of our strategies and some of the things I found in our poem that fit the strategies for today's lesson. So now that we've read through our poem 3 times, we can start analyzing the poem using our strategies for today's lesson. So the first thing I notice is that our poem has 2 stanzas made up of 10 lines. Now let's talk about the rhythm of our poem. So our rhythm alternates between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. And what does that mean exactly? Well, thank you for asking. Iambic means a foot of poetry that follows the pattern of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So tetrameter would be a line written with 4 feet or 8 syllables. So an iambic trimeter would have 3 feet or 6 syllables. Now let's talk about the rhyme of our poem. So the poem we read uses things like alliteration, simile, satire, and it has an internal rhyme, but there's no regular end rhyme scheme, meaning when you are reading it, it's not one of those like sing-songy rhymes that you would hear in some other poems. So the rhyme in this poem isn't quite as obvious as some of our other poems that we've read. So something else that this poem uses is the use of pronouns. So using you, we, us, and your. And the purpose of doing this is so that you, as the reader, are drawn into the poem. You feel like you are a part of the poem. And lastly, we're going to talk about the theme. So one possible theme for our poem is that being nameless is better than having fame. And remember, when you were trying to find the theme of the poem, you want to make an inference about what the author is trying to make you understand. What lesson can you learn? It's just like finding the theme of a story, but this time we're using a poem instead. So did you come up with a different theme than I did? That's perfectly okay. Let me know what theme you came up with. Alright, so far I've done a lot of analyzing the poem, but now I want you to try to analyze the poem. And I want you to come up with different examples than what I came up with. So you're going to use the Inference Graphic Organizer, and that is in Google Classroom under Poetry Lesson 1. You can write right in it. And you are going to choose 3 descriptive statements from the poem and write an inference for each statement. And if you want, you can draw an illustration to accompany your inference, and since we're working in Google Classroom, if you just want to attach a picture to it, that's fine too. But I want you to try to come up with other examples than the ones I used. So that is your homework for today's lesson.